Welcome back to the Ubuntu server series here at CBT Nuggets. Today we're going to talk about web and databases. Now you don't want to mix those up, you could ruin Spider-Man's day. Let's get down to business, and we're going to start with Apache 2, the web server in Ubuntu. Now I said Apache 2, and that is the web server that most people are going to use in Ubuntu or in any server on the planet, to be quite honest. However, I don't think that I'd be doing us justice if I didn't mention Nginx. Now this is an alternative to Apache. A lot of people prefer it, and by a lot I mean a lot of people prefer it. It's sleeker, it's faster, it's more stable, it's supposedly just the most awesome thing since sliced bread. I've used this before. The configuration is simple, but by default, most people are still going to use Apache 2. The internet runs on Apache, and it's the one that if you're working on a system, it's probably going to be Apache 2. But if you're a geek and you're looking for something to do on a weekend, I recommend checking out Nginx. That's just a side note. I'm going to talk about Apache 2, and the thing about Apache 2, or Apache in general, it's been around for a long time. It used to be that there was one configuration file called httpd for daemon, so http://daemon.conf, and everything, and I mean everything, was in that single configuration file. And then as the years went on, and as distributions, installed more and more versions of Apache, they started to break things up into multiple files. At first it was kind of confusing. So which file do I put it in? The important thing to know is that with Apache, it doesn't generally matter where you put the configuration. If you just want to have, one file to rule them all, well, that's okay. You just put everything in the single configuration file. Apache will read that in, and that's going to be your config. However, Ubuntu particularly has a really great way. They have configuration files in folders, but even more than that, they use a very simple but fairly elegant method of symbolic linking to enable and unenable or disable things like modules and virtual hosts and things like that. We're going to look at it. And the other thing that they do is, since they've broken everything up into multiple files that Apache reads in, like the entire folder worth of files, it means that packages have a much easier time of adding a declaration and removing a declaration. They don't have to, the installer doesn't have to worry about editing this single configuration file. They just create their own file, make sure it's in the correct location, and then Apache will read it in. And then if you uninstall it, it just cleans up after itself. It deletes the file that it created, and then Apache doesn't see it anymore. So it's a very elegant way. We're going to look at, I was going to actually write all the different folders in here that are on the system, but it would be confusing. Let's just look at the system itself and see where all the files are, and this symbolic linking stuff that I'm talking about. Now, there are there's a main location. Everything in Ubuntu is stored in etc. Apache 2 folder. So that's where everything is stored, except for in little type down here, var/www. That's where the actual web pages are stored by default. So the default website's going to be in var www. You can reassign that, but by default, that's where it goes. And almost everything else goes into this Apache 2. All of these configuration file things that we're talking about, they're going to be in etc. Apache 2. So let's go to our server and check it out to see this folder structure that I'm talking about. And then we'll do some things and, see how it works in action. All right? Okay, let's start up our handy dandy terminal session to the server. And let's go into the etc. Apache 2 folder. In here, actually I'm going to do ls-l just to get some more information. I just want to point out some things that are in here. So the apache2.conf file, this is right now the standard configuration file that comes with Apache. It's generally the one that you don't want to edit a whole lot. However, it contains a lot of information to understand how it works. So let's look at it really quick. And so basically this is the standard configuration file. The thing I really want to point out is that yes, you can change files in here. However, the big thing I want to show you, there's a lot of, defaults, and these defaults are probably fine for most situations. However, if we scroll down far enough, we'll see where it actually includes things like it includes mods enabled folder, all the .load files and .conf files in there. It includes the httpd.conf file. It includes the ports.conf file. And if you go down here, it includes every file in conf.d and every file in the sites enabled file. And what the include statement means is include it, basically. Take this configuration file and add to it all these files that we just specified. And basically what that means for us is that wherever we put our configuration terms in the other files, as long as it's one of the ones that are included, it's going to be parsed by the Apache daemon on startup. So from here we just have conventions. Okay, so let's look at the rest of the files and we'll talk about some conventions. Conf.d, this is a folder, and any file in there will get parsed by Apache. So if you have a third-party product, like we're going to look at a little bit later when we talk about MySQL and PHPMyAdmin, it's going to put configuration files in here so that Apache will parse it. Then if you delete it, it'll delete its file without touching any of the configuration files here. It's a really kind of fascinating way that they've approached that. Environment variables, it could have been in Apache too, but it's not. The environment variables are, we're not going to go too much into there, but these are things that just set up the Apache environment, like what the path is for the Apache daemon, how much memory it can use, etc., etc. I'll skip this one. I'll talk about that in a second. Magic, this is MIME stuff. Now, if you're familiar with MIME types, it's like a .torrent file is a specific MIME type, and how the server handles it is specified in this magic file, which is talking about MIME types. Ports.conf, this is where things pertaining to ports, like tell it to listen on port 80, or if you want to tell it to do name-based serving on port 80, this is the place that conventionally you would put that information. And the nice thing is that if we look at that, most things are in here, and by default name virtual host is on, or actually I may have turned that on. I don't remember if this is commented out by default or not. But what this was here, I didn't add this. At the very most it was commented out. I don't remember which way it comes, but name virtual host tells it to listen on all addresses on port 80, and this tells the daemon to actually listen on port 80. A little redundant. However, what name virtual host means is listen for the names. So whether, if you have multiple server names addressing one IP address, it'll listen to all of its IP addresses, port 80, for name-based virtual hosting. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. This is the place that you turn that on. Same thing if we're going to set up SSL or HTTPS type traffic. This is the same place that we tell it to listen on port 443. Let's get out of here real quick though. That's where that's set up. httpd.conf. The reason I did ls-l is I wanted to show you this is zero length. This is an empty file. So if you're going to add things, like you want to add an Apache 2 declaration, you can put it into this, and this is kind of like the place where you put your own custom stuff. So you don't have to remember, where did I put it? Is it a file called sean.conf inside this folder? This is the user put stuff in file place. That was a horrible way to say it. If you have customizations you want to make to Apache, you can add them to the httpd.conf file, and it will parse that along with everything else. Now, the really cool thing, well, it's all pretty cool how they have it set up, but the things that I specifically want to show you are these. So mods available, mods enabled, sites available, and sites enabled. So in here, these are all 4 folders, but let's look at the sites available first. So here we have 2 files. Okay, let's do ls-l. These are files that contain declarations about sites. Virtual name hosting, remember it was turned on in ports.conf? Well, these are where those are defined. So if we look at default, we'll see that it specifies. Now this isn't going to specify a server name because this is the default. This is where if it's not defined in another file, this is the default it falls back to. Generally, I like the default to be something that just says welcome to the server, or that redirects somewhere else. This is basically the fallback if somebody addresses to your server on an address that it's not listening for, like Sean's desk.nuggetlab.com it may be listening for, and if not, it always defaults back to this default virtual host. Anyway, any file in this folder, so here are the files in this folder. These are files. This folder is not parsed. So sites available is not parsed by the Apache daemon on startup. The place for that is sites enabled. And this is not another bunch of files. These are symbolic links to that place we just were, to the sites available folder, that file. So see this 000-default? Now they put zeros in front so that it's the first thing loaded. And what this means is now the Apache daemon is going to parse it, because if you remember in that apache2.conf file that we looked at first, sites available isn't parsed, so we have to create that symbolic link in sites enabled to make sure that that file that exists in sites available is actually parsed, because sites enabled is parsed by Apache on startup. You'll see right now default-SSL is not parsed. So this file in here is not active. It's not going to have a default SSL site. It's not going to read this configuration file, whatever may be in here. The Apache daemon is going to ignore it because it's not in the sites enabled. And the same thing is true in the mods available. These are all the modules that are available for Apache that are currently installed. So all of these are different modules, and in order to make those available, again, this mod's available. These files are not parsed by the Apache daemon on startup. However, everything in mods enabled, these are all symbolic links that point to these. So you see there's only about roughly a third of the available modules that are currently enabled. So how could we enable modules? Well, there's a couple ways. We could make symbolic links ourselves using ln-s, or we could use some tools that are available on the command line. Tools like a2nmod. So Apache 2 enable mod, and then pick one of these. Let's see, one that is not currently loaded. It looks like cache is not here, so let's try that. So here we have enabling the module cache. Now if we do an ls of the mods enabled, we should now see cache in there. See there? Bam. Now cache is symbolically linked in this mods enabled folder, and the Apache daemon is going to parse the file up here on load, because remember, this is just linking to this file. So when it parses all the things in here, it's going to refer it to all of the files that are symbolically linked to these actual module files. Okay? So that is how that works. You can also do the same with a tool, a sudo a2nsite. So Apache 2 enable site, and let's do default-SSL. Remember that was in there? So we do that, and now it's enabled the site default-SSL. Let's look into sites enabled, and we'll see now it's made that symbolic link. You want to see the symbolic link that I'm talking about. So now default SSL is linked to the sites available default SSL. Now if there's nothing in there, it's going to give us an error, right? So if we say a2nsite Bob's place, it's going to say, dude, there is no site defined in sites available called Bob's place. So we have to create that site and then do it. Now you can manually do this. I just want it to be clear that this tool, A2nsite or A2nmod, these are just tools that make a symbolic link. That's all they do. In fact, they warn you to activate this, you actually have to reload Apache. Okay, it hasn't reloaded the server at all. It's just created that symbolic link. And that's how the really cool, really awesome folder structure for Apache 2 is set up. All right, let's talk about kind of some of the things that we've done here, and we'll move forward testing some of this stuff out. So here we are back at the whiteboard, and I realize there's just a bunch. Oh, hi Phoebe. That's my little dog Phoebe who wants to go outside. So hang on, I'll be right back. And we're back with the dog outside. Anyway, like I was saying, there's a lot of information on this slide, and a lot of it's kind of boring, so we'll just call it random factoids. And they're colorful factoids, which will hopefully make them more interesting. So we talked about these tools that come with the Apache install on Ubuntu, and these basically just do symbolic linking. If you're comfortable with symbolic linking, you don't have to use these shortcut tools, but you can if you want to. So realize that these don't do a whole lot. They don't restart the service. They didn't do anything like that. There is one tool that is available in Ubuntu, but I don't actually recommend using it. You can run this on the command line if you want, but it's not really Ubuntu-y, right? It's not really the way to restart a service. In fact, if you remember, when we used these tools, they actually said to do service Apache 2 restart instead of Apache control or Apache CTL restart. Even the Apache programs recommend using the standard Ubuntu service restarting tool. So I recommend doing that, but you should know that this exists. So if somebody talks about Apache control, the program, just know that this is a way to restart the server process. Again, don't necessarily recommend using it because it's not Ubuntu-y. So Apache 2, here's another, we'll put it in a box because it's kind of its own factoid, right? Apache runs as a user. So every daemon on the Linux system runs as a user in a group. Right? We know that already. A lot of times, some services run as root. Apache 2 runs as www- this is a dash, data with the group www-data. Now this is important because since that's the user that Apache runs as, all of the files like in var www, all of those files have to at least be readable by www-data. And if you want the web server to be able to upload files or write changes to a configuration file, it has to have write access. This user is the one who, when you're thinking about what kind of access do I want my web server to have to my underlying file system, it's the www-data user that Apache runs as. So just think of Apache as a user with those credentials when you're thinking about ownership of files. Okay, so that's kind of important. This is Debian and Ubuntu kind of thing. On other systems, it's different. It may be, HTTPD may be the user, but in Ubuntu and also in Debian, www-data is the user and group that Apache runs as. And then I just wanted to mention this. You remember all those modules that we saw, like the cache module that we enabled? A lot of these are installable separate from Apache itself. So if you need a specific module, like if you're setting up a reverse proxy and you need to have the proxy HTTP module, I highly recommend to try to use the packaged modules. So use apt-get, use the Software Center, use that sort of a thing to install the modules, because it's going to be the right version, it's going to be put in the right place. These tools are going to work because it's going to actually put the modules in the right place. So I very much recommend that if you need a specific module for an application, to go through and use the prepackaged ones. Just like you installed Apache 2 from a prepackaged instance, do the same thing with additional modules. Okay? So that's all the Ubuntu specific things about Apache. I'm not going to go into detail as far as how to create a virtual host, how to do those sorts of things, because that's not really specific to Ubuntu. And I cover those in a lot of our other Nugget series, like Linux in the Real World, LPIC, and I don't want to just reiterate over and over the same things, but this is what makes Apache 2 unique on Ubuntu. I am going to show you how the configuration files are in use, and we're going to do that with the second half of our Nugget about databases, because databases are something that's simple to set up. We're going to set up MySQL on our server, and then we're going to install a configuration program. It's a web-based configuration program for MySQL. It's powerful, it's awesome, it's used everywhere. But that'll do two things. One, it'll show us how to configure MySQL, but it will also show us how packages handle installing things into the Apache 2 folder structure. So let's check out databases, and then we'll see how Apache 2 handles programs. So back here in the command line, I want to quickly show you how to install the MySQL or MySQL server. Now, MySQL is arguably the most commonly used database system in Ubuntu. Postgres is also available, but usually when we talk about a LAMP stack, it's Linux, Apache, MySQL, and PHP. So that's generally the database system that you're going to be running into on the command line. Anyway, to install it, simply sudo apt-get install MySQL server. And it's going to install all the dependencies. It's going to install the client so that you can interact with it on the command line. And during the install, it'll ask us one question. And that is, what is the root user's password going to be? It's important to remember this because it's something that we're going to need. Now, this is not the only user that you should have. Usually the practice is to make a user for every database, especially if there's other clients, if you have separate clients using separate database users. But the root account, you have to set up the password during the install. So I'm going to do that. Once it's installed, we can interact with the CLI, or the command line interface, and that's simply MySQL is the name, or MySQL is the command. To get there, -u root, because that's the only user that exists right now, and -p. Now, if you wanted to actually type the password here, you could do that, but I recommend, if you're using it interactively on the command line, just to type -p, and then it will ask you for the password, so that it's not echoed on the screen when you enter it. So I entered the password. Here we are in here. We can do things like create database test. And apparently a test database exists by default. How funny is that? Okay, so let's try again. Create database. I don't exist. With the semicolon at the end. There, we've created a database. There, it wasn't list databases, it was show databases. My apologies for not remembering the exact command. But anyway, so here we have the different databases that exist by default. Here's the one, I don't exist. Here's the test one that I tried to create but was already in existence. And this is the command line interface. We can add data, we can add schemas, we can add tables, but it's not necessarily the easiest way to visualize things. I actually prefer, and most web hosts, if that have MySQL features built into your hosting plan, will use phpMyAdmin. So let's type quit, clear, and let's actually install that. So sudo apt-get install phpMyAdmin. So you're going to say yes, let it do its thing. While it's installing, let's go back to the slide and go over what we're doing here. So MySQL, I talked about, that's the most commonly used database system in Ubuntu. It's just very commonly used, especially for web-based applications. The back end is often a MySQL database. The CLI interface, which we looked at, is standard. There's nothing Ubuntu-y specific about that, apart from now we know that the test database is created by default when it's installed. But there's nothing specific about how CLI, the command line interface, works. And what we're doing right now in the background is we're installing phpMyAdmin. And what this is going to do, it's going to do two things. It's going to show us a really awesome way to manage SQL databases, and we're going to see how packages add things to the Apache 2 infrastructure. So let's see what's actually happening behind the scenes. Back here in the install process, it's saying, hey, I can configure things automatically if you like. What web server would you like me to configure automatically? So we have the option of automatically configuring Apache 2, which is what we're going to do. I'm going to hit the space bar. It will also apparently configure if we're using light HTTPD, which is a lightweight, as you can imagine, web server, but we're not using that. We're using the standard Apache 2, so we're going to say OK. And it's going to add the file we're going to look at in a second, and then restart the Apache web server. If you are watching there, it's going to restart it again there. And now it says the phpMyAd package must have a database installed and configured. So should we configure the database for phpMyAdmin with dbconfig common? Now that's talking about the interactive system that we use to set that root password. So let's say yes. Let's have the system actually configure that. And it needs to know what the database administrative user is. Well, do you remember what it was? Its root is the administrative user they're talking about. So what is the password of the database administrative user? And then you say, okay, so what password do we want to use for phpMyAdmin? It'll generate a random one if we don't put anything. I recommend you put something different than your root password. That's why it's not using that password by default. It wants you to do something different. So we'll put something different. And now it's gone through and set up our server. So let's see what it did behind the scenes here. Okay, now the last thing it did is it restarted Apache 2. I talk about this a lot before, where Apache 2 could not reliably determine the fully qualified domain name. This is just something that is in the hosts file. We can get rid of this. This is not an error. This is just telling us that it couldn't tell exactly what its host file is. But this is just a warning, nothing to worry about. But in here, if you remember, the conf.d folder was empty, and now it contains some stuff. Well, I guess it wasn't empty, but it didn't contain anything about phpMyAdmin. Now, if you look there, it's light blue, which probably means that it's a symbolic link. Now, we know that Apache will follow symbolic links because that's how the sites enabled, sites available kind of thing works. So what this has done is it's created a shortcut from the phpMyAdmin apache.conf file in the etc. So if these dot dots mean dot 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 goes, so it's etc. phpMyAdmin apache.conf is actually where this file is located, and we can look at it to see what it actually does. And what it does, it says alias anytime we're on a web server, website hosted on this server, and we type / phpMyAdmin, it's saying, I really want you to display the contents of user share phpMyAdmin. And it gives us a whole bunch of PHP rules and stuff like that. However, what that means for us is if we go to Firefox and we open up the server, remember 80 is the address of our server. See, it says, look, a working web server. This is the default site that's set up. So if we go to phpMyAdmin, that should be alias to that other site. And sure enough, all of a sudden now we have a working website, even though if we look in the var www folder, there is no phpMyAdmin folder. What we've done is we've used this configuration file to create an alias. So that's how the Apache 2 folder system allows for a package like phpMyAdmin to add itself so that it's easily accessible, easy to install and uninstall without modifying any of the other Apache 2 configuration files. It's very, very important. Username, we can type root and then that password that we know is root. Once we're inside here, this is where we can do all sorts of things. Like we can add users, we can add databases, we can create a new database. In privileges, we can talk about different users, right? We can create a new user. Just like we created that phpMyAdmin user, and then we created the root user, we can also create new users and give them privileges from this account or from other systems. This phpMyAdmin is a very powerful tool to manipulate MySQL databases. But even more importantly, well, yes, this is a great way to look at MySQL databases, but even more importantly, I wanted to show you how Apache handles configuration files. All right, so let's make sure we got everything covered, and you should be able to go onto your system and play with MySQL and Apache to see how things work. All right, back at our original Apache slide, remember http d.conf used to be the place where everything was stored. Now it comes empty, and you can put your custom configurations in there. And we learned all about the cool way that the folder structure for Apache 2 and Ubuntu is set up. We also learned all of the different things that are important to know about Apache 2 specific to Ubuntu, like the www-data user and group, so that files created by Apache will have that ownership, and also they have to have that user has to have access to files in order to display them on a web page. Otherwise, you'll just get forbidden messages from the Apache web server. Okay? That is web and databases in Ubuntu server. I hope that this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.